Hello, everyone. My name is Sathya Gopalakrishnan. I'm an environmental and natural resource economist at The Ohio State University. Thank you for tuning in to this session of the IGCP 725 workshop. And a big thanks to Chris Hine and the other organizers for inviting me to share an economic perspective to the various topics that we're discussing around coastal economic systems and forecasting coastal change. This talk is probably going to be the farthest away from your core discipline, but it does have something to do with forecasting coastal change. Especially because the systems we're thinking about and the regions we're thinking about are where we have a lot of people, and the decisions that people make on the coast, decisions about where to live, where to build, where to invest in adaptation, all of these decisions do affect how the system as a whole will evolve over time. So my goal here is to introduce you to the way that economists think about the coastal economic system as a whole, the kinds of questions we ask, the kinds of data or the information that we need to better understand the value of coastal resources and coastal risk, how these decisions that people make in turn have feedbacks into the coastal evolution itself, and also to think about why we need to understand both the human system and the coastal system to think about the evolution or the coastal evolution, and to devise policies that will lead to more resilient communities and adaptation. Before I move any further, I do want to acknowledge all the different collaborators that are represented in this work that we've been doing for over 10 years now, to work closely with economists and coastal geomorphologists to understand the coupled coastal economic system. If you've already heard Eli Lazarus talk in this workshop, then what you'll see here is kind of looking at several of the same modeling frameworks, but from the human perspective, or from the way in which economists ask the question and set up the model, and what are the types of questions that we're trying to model within the coupled human and coastal system. So let's start by thinking about, value of housing on the coast. One of the reasons why there is a lot of investment in coastal adaptation is to protect the value of housing and infrastructure along these densely developed coastal regions. So this house in the Outer Banks of North Carolina is in June of 2022 was estimated to be almost $400,000. And now within a few weeks of this assessment, that value can go down to literally $0 if the property ends up crumbling into the ocean. And in this particular case, this was not even because of a storm, but just the degradation of property because of chronic erosion, right? Why does this matter? It matters because more and more people are living on the coast, right? We know this. Covering only about 10% of the land area, coastal counties in the United States account for about 40% of the population, with population density being at least twice as much as the average national average density in the country. While most of what I'm going to be talking about is work done in the U.S., in the United States Atlantic coast, all the concepts that we'll be discussing actually apply to many regions in the world. So we're talking about these densely developed coasts that are facing increasing risk. We see more and more number of intense storms and storm and flood events are also increasing. And along with that increase, the increase in damages. So this is just plotting the billion-dollar disasters over the years. If you think of 2024 alone, the damages from hurricanes and coastal extreme events was nearly $190 billion. So this is a trend that we're seeing over time, not news at all to this audience. But even as the risk along the coast continues to increase, coastal property values, the blue line that you see here, which represents property values along the coast, uh, the premium on coastal property values continues to persist. So coastal housing and property values continue to increase in value and are, despite the growing risk, continue to maintain a high value and value that is going up over time. So what's going on here? To what extent does the economic system or these housing markets reflect coastal change? And what can we understand from the ways in which these housing markets respond, how housing markets change? What can we understand about the coastal environment itself? And that's kind of one of the questions that we're going to be looking at. So what happens when we think about a coupled coastal economic system? We see, sea level rise and storms affecting coastal communities through chronic erosion or storm surge and other storm events. And what's at risk here are property and infrastructure that and the damage that is faced because of these either pulse or press stressors, right? So in response to in response to storms and erosion, coastal communities take policy action to adapt and to protect their communities, and these policy responses through human manipulation of the coastline further then go back and feedback into the coastal dynamics themselves. So what's going on here? We see a forcing from storms that can potentially cause damage, or we get the amenities from wide beaches and these coastal resources. In response to wanting to maintain that value, humans intervene by putting in place policies. These policies then interact and affect the coastal dynamics themselves. And what's important about this coupled human and natural system is the fact that both of these dynamics, the dynamics around what humans are doing on the coast, where they're living, how they're adapting, how they're changing the built environment, and the dynamics of the coastal system are along the same time scale. So these changes are going on in the annual to decadal timescales, which means that the coupling is really tight in a lot of these communities. In response to coastal risk, we see communities either putting in place hardened structures like seawalls to protect housing right over here. And in the absence of seawalls, you'd see the shore face continue to maintain its profile, but you lose the land where there's the retreat, which then affects housing, in similar to the image we saw right at the beginning. Because because hardened structures tend to worsen erosion in neighboring locations, all the way to several kilometers along the coast, there has been a shift towards thinking about beach renourishment or placing sand on the beach, on the coastline to build out the coast. And therefore, once you can see this image before and after a beach nourishment project. This is in Nags Head, North Carolina. After placing dredged sand on the beach, you get this wider beach in front that protects the development line, which then acts as a buffer when there is a storm and maintains that the amenity value, the value of recreation and tourism, and the use of why we might want to be on the beach. So this is the periodic replenishment of an eroding beach with dredged sand, and to a large extent, the U.S., the East Coast, has pushed for many beach nourishment projects, and this has been going on over almost over more than half a century now. But the problem here, we've spent millions of dollars annually, about $150 million annually being spent on beach renourishment projects. But this ends up being a task that you have to keep repeating, right? So every time you put sand on the beach, that sand is going to erode because of how the coastal dynamics, how alongshore sediment transport is going to want to move the system back to its equilibrium shore face equilibrium profile. And what you have is that it's going to erode. It's not only going to erode, it's probably going to erode faster, right? And so you have to keep doing this over and over again. You build out the beach, it's going to erode, and then you have to decide when to build it out again in perpetuity, right? So why do we need to study this as a coupled system? So a few takeaways from what we have learned over the past several years of working in this area. So the first thing we need is we need to understand geophysical processes because they affect economic values on the coast, right? So in order to understand how much beaches are worth and how those values get reflected in the decisions that people make, in the market transactions that people make, we need to understand what those geophysical processes are. How housing markets reflect both the value of the resource and the amenities that coasts provide, and also how the shoreline stabilization effort, the policies, then get reflected in housing values as well, is one way to think about how geophysical processes affect economic values. Economic behavior also affects coastal evolution, right? So we need to understand what humans are doing, where they're building, where they're building homes and roads and the built environment, as well as where they're investing in adaptation measures. Both affect how the coastline will evolve over time. So geophysical processes affect economic values that we're interested in, and economic behavior in turn affects coastal dynamics and the evolution of the coastline itself. And a point that I'm going to um, try and demonstrate here in the next few minutes is that when we're making these adaptation decisions that are typically short-term decisions, while they are effective in the short run, they can potentially be maladaptive in the long run. And then it's not just that the geophysical system affects the economic values, economic behavior affects the geophysical system, but then feedbacks, both spatial and dynamic feedbacks between the economic and the coastal system affects adaptation investment and affects optimal investments along the coast. So what we found there is that these feedbacks really matter. The spillovers across space and time matter for how much, when, where, and how much we want to invest in these adaptation measures. And in the case of in what I'm going to be talking about, we'll focus largely on beach renourishment as that adaptation strategy. What we also find is that there is a need to coordinate along the coastline, but because there is no incentive to self-organize, we find that if you have decentralized, what I'm going to show is that if we have decentralized management, it tends to be worse off. All communities tend to be worse off relative to coordination, but then you need government intervention or some kind of a policy to enforce coordination along the coast, right? So we need to study this system in order to understand and answer any of these questions. What is the optimal, or what would be the effective way to manage the coastline? In order to understand that, and in order to develop policies, we need both the geophysical processes and economic decision making. So what does economics tell us? So largely economists use markets as a source of information, because markets and market behavior and transactions that are made, so observations in several markets, give us a lot of information, right? They give us information through what are market outcomes. For example, what are the prices at which coastal real estate is being bought and sold, right? Does coastal change, whether it's sea level rise and storm risk, does that get capitalized into home values? And can we use our observed housing values to recover or to learn something about how much people are willing to pay for coastal amenities, how much people are willing to pay to mitigate coastal risk, right? So market outcomes, so the prices that we observe, give us a lot of information about how much people value coastal amenities and how much they value minimizing coastal risk. Markets also reveal information through people's behavior, where people choose to buy a home, where they choose to build homes, and how often and in what locations people invest. We invest in both private and public risk mitigation, right? So those decisions, both from a policy perspective and individual private decisions, that are reflected in market outcomes, also tell us a lot about the coastal environment. And finally, markets give us information through policy induced changes. So when there are adaptation policies put in place, so when we decide to, say, nourish a beach and stabilize the shoreline along some portion of the coastline, then do these local adaptation investments then get internalized or reflected in market outcomes? Do these adaptation investments then have spillover effects into neighboring locations? And what are the types of policies? So can we come up with spatially targeted taxes or subsidies that could then incentivize the behavior where we want for coastal resilience, right? For where we want to optimally invest. So this is how economists think about or these are the kinds of questions that economists are interested in. How do we value coastal resources? How do we use those values then to think about forward-looking policies in order to ensure that we're managing the coastline in a way that will lead to more resilient coastal communities and reduce that or mitigate risk, right? So what I'm going to do now is give you a few examples of how we do some of this analysis, and hopefully I'll tie it back to why the information we get from economic outcomes and economic behavior help us understand something about this coupled system also. So housing markets, respond directly to coastal change, right? So whether it's shoreline erosion or storms, or the actions that people are making by dredging and placing sand in different parts of the coastline, all of these all of these factors that affect coastal change get reflected in housing market values, right? And they affect the economic value of what we call the natural capital. So the built capital being houses, roads, infrastructure, and the natural capital being, vegetated beaches or in any kind of environmental setting, forests and wetlands and so on, right? So housing markets give us a lot of information, but they also directly respond to coastal change. So we can use the observed outcomes. We can use these prices, the prices at which or what people are willing to pay to buy homes on the coast, and link it with how that coastline is changing to understand the incremental value or the premiums that people are willing to pay to avoid avoid storm risk, or or the premium that they're willing to pay for a wider beach or for the coastal amenities that they get to enjoy. So one such study in North Carolina is where we took real estate data, so property prices, sale prices, a number of property characteristics. So we try to control for what kind of home it is, how old it is, how many rooms, how much square footage does it have, a pool, and so on and so forth, and link that with beach attributes, right? The location of the beach, how how well the beach is maintained. So in terms of like beach width being a salient indicator of the health of that beach, right? So if it's a wider beach, you're going to get larger amenities, and we use the changes that are observed in the housing market to back out what is the value that people place on beach width, on the amenities that a wide beach provides, right? So what we found here is when we're looking at property values, when we're looking at the prices at which housing is being traded along the coast, beach width is one of the salient indicators of the amenities that you get. However, beach width itself depends on nourishment decisions. If there is nourishment, if there are policies in place to stabilize the shoreline, then the width of the beach depends on how much people are investing to stabilize that shoreline, and where those stabilization decisions and where those beach nourishment projects are being implemented, in fact, depends on property values themselves, right? You're likely to invest in maintaining the beach in locations where there is where the value of housing or where the value at risk is quite high. So you can see the circularity here, right? Beach width depends on nourishment, which in fact depends on property values, and property values then depend on beach width itself. So we need to account for this feedback. We need to account for the simultaneity, the feedback between the coastal decision or adaptation decisions and what's happening to property values in order to credibly or recover reliable estimates of how much people are willing to pay for wider beaches, right? So this work, which is one of the early work that looks at this simultaneity, we find that when we ignore these feedbacks, when we don't think about the fact that beach nourishment affects width, and then width affects property values. When we ignore those feedbacks, we end up estimating the value of beaches being quite low relative to when we account for those feedbacks, and that difference is almost a factor of 5. So that's a large, we've been undervaluing beaches if we did not know that there was this dynamics going on between stabilization activity and beach width, right? So this is one way in which you can think about how the coastal environment affects real estate markets. Now, it's not just that that beach width is the indicator. We can also look at whether what is the impact of that first nourishment project. So we can think of how beach renourishment reduces storm risk. So this is the study where we ignore all the locations that we had in our earlier study that had engaged in nourishment activity before. We look at the Outer Banks, where there was no beach nourishment until 2011, and then we look at the impact of that first nourishment in Nag's Head on the perceived storm risks. Now, Sandy in 2012, Hurricane Sandy mostly affected New York and New Jersey. In the large impact was there, but the impact of that storm was felt all the way south, as far south as North Carolina to some extent. And what we did here is we looked at the extent to which the impact of the storm affected locations that had been nourished relative to locations that had not been nourished. So what we're doing here again is we're looking at the housing market, which again reflects these changes in the coastal environment, and we're trying to isolate or identify what is that incremental value of beach renourishment. So what we find here is, again, just as a reminder, we look at these two regions, a region that was nourished, this is Nag's Head, and a region that was not nourished, Kitty Hawk. And the first nourishment activity happens in 2011, right over here. If you look at the trend in housing prices, the trend is all throughout. Nags Head has higher property values, which is probably why nourishment happens in Nags Head. Then we have Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and you can see here that the effect of the storm in terms of that risk signal that the storm sends, which then affects property values, that signal is much higher. So the discount or the decrease in property values after the storm is felt much more steeply by regions that did not invest in shoreline stabilization relative to the community that did invest in shoreline stabilization. So what we found here is that the near shore homes, homes that are within the 100 to 200, within 100 and within a 200-meter distance from the coastline on a nourished beach, ended up getting a 13.5% premium from that risk mitigation due to beach renourishment after Hurricane Sandy. So that perceived risk that depreciates housing values was felt lower in a nourished location, which then gives us a way to back out how much more people are willing to pay. So how much of that storm mitigation or that risk mitigation impact of shoreline stabilization is then captured by real estate markets. So real estate markets, because of the number of transactions that happen and the data that we get, really are a very commonly used outcome measure to think about recovering the value of coastal amenities and the cost of coastal damages or risk. So this is one way in which economists use data on coastal change and kind of incorporate the dynamics into thinking about how we value the coast. Now, these values then are used to think about how do we manage, where should we be investing, what is the optimal investment decision, and where and how much should we be investing in adaptation. So that brings us to thinking about these geoeconomic systems, so systems that are more tightly coupled. And we talked about these temporal feedbacks, right? So you have a town here that decides to nourish its beach, so it decides to build out its beach. The kinds of decisions that we're asking from a policy perspective are how often do you rebuild, how much sand do you dredge, how far out do you want to build out the beach, and what type of adaptation strategy. Are we going to build seawalls? Are we going to do nourishment? And where are we going to invest in adaptation? So these are the policy questions. And in order to answer any one of them, we need to understand these feedbacks between the geomorphological processes that are affecting the erosion rate, the sediment transport rate, and the storm risks, right? So in this model, the economic model was one where we're asking the question, assuming that we are investing in beach renourishment in this one community, how often will we be rebuilding the beach? Assuming again that we're going to rebuild it to an initial width, and accounting for that erosion dynamics. When you build out the beach, it's going to erode faster. So we're taking into account that sediment transport dynamics in determining what that optimal interval or optimal frequency of building out the beach should be. So that's the question where we have these geophysical feedbacks, and that feedback affects the demand or the frequency of investment in natural capital, which is building out the beach as a repeated or a periodic process, right? So just as a quick way to think about how we model these coastal economic systems or these coupled systems, I think this you might hear a flavor of this in Eli's session as well. When we are modeling these systems, you want to start with simple models. So the insights that we can draw can come from relatively simple coastal dynamics coupled with a fairly sophisticated or a more complex economic model, such as what I described right now when we're thinking about how should we optimally invest in periodic renourishment. The economic question is an infinite horizon, a long-term dynamic model of how much do we periodically invest over time that accounts for what the benefits you get, those benefits being measured in the way that that I described, using changes in the using the real estate market to get at what those benefits are, estimating the costs of renourishment, and then using those benefits and costs over a long time horizon to understand what to derive what that optimal nourishment frequency might be. So when we're modeling the economics, we even using somewhat simplified coastal dynamics can give us a lot of insight into what that economic outcome or what the optimal behavior should be. On the other hand, we can take more complex coastal modeling and couple it with some more simplistic economic heuristics that are then drawn from the underlying economic theory. So using economic behavior that we understand from the theory, but coming up with somewhat simpler heuristics to model how a coastal system might change. And then we can progress to thinking about modeling a coupled, complex coastal and economic dynamics simultaneously. So this was, we first started with the simple coastal dynamics, just thinking about erosion and only that temporal feedback, and coming up with what that optimal nourishment interval could be. So what we found there is that higher property values, so if you have higher property values, you're going to nourish more frequently. If there's higher erosion, so if the erosion rates are erosion rate goes up, we're likely to nourish more frequently. If the beach value goes up, that is, if we're the capitalized value that we get from our empirical estimation, if the value placed on beach amenities is higher, then you're going to invest more frequently in shoreline stabilization. And then we found that when we think about sand costs, the cost of dredging sand, the effect is ambiguous because we're trading off the effect of, fixed costs of dredging with the variable costs of how much sand you want to put. So do we want to wait and dredge less frequently, but that means we're going to incur a very high fixed cost, or are we going to add a little bit of sand more frequently, where we're trying to minimize those or reduce those variable costs? So we found this kind of U-shaped relationship when it comes to how sand costs vary, right? Now, when you look here, just going back to that feedback here, property values, high property values are going to influence the frequency of beach renourishment. Beach renourishment is going to affect beach value. And so what we have here again is this feedback, right? Like more nourishment means higher value is going to be more nourishment again. And so you have this positive feedback loop, which is going to lead to, more frequent renourishment. So this is just thinking about a single community, a single community that's making these decisions about when to nourish or how often to rebuild or to stabilize the shoreline. And in the economic question, we're trying to maximize the net value of housing along that entire coastline, taking into account the geomorphology and the geophysical feedbacks in the system, right? Now, to make this a little more complicated, we can think about not just one community, but multiple communities along the coast, right? And when we make these predictions, when we take this model and apply it to how often different beach communities should be investing in renourishment effort, when we take this to the data, what we found is when we estimate the value of beach width, when we estimate those values, accounting for these feedbacks, then the predicted nourishment interval, the predicted frequency with which these towns are going to invest in beach renourishment tends to be much closer to the observed observed nourishment intervals. So this is the 45-degree line, and points closer to this line means our model predicts, the prediction from our model is closer to what we observe in the data, whereas when we don't account for the feedback, the predicted frequency tends to be farther away from, or tends to be less reliable in reflecting what communities are actually doing, right? So there's, one, we need better values. In order to get those better values, we need to understand how the geomorphology of the system affects the value of coastal width, which is then reflected in these housing markets. When we use those values with the feedback, with accounting for these dynamics, then we're able to better predict what the coastal evolution is going to be, in a sense, how often these communities are going to be investing in shoreline adaptation or stabilization effort. Then we can take this to a more complex model, where we're not thinking only about one community, but multiple communities along the coast. And when we have one community that is investing in beach renourishment and building out the coast, building out the beach in front of it, then that is going to cause a disequilibrium in the shoreline, and it's going to eventually have that sand is going to diffuse and is going to diffuse in the alongshore direction, which means that it's going to be adding sand to the neighboring communities. So how are communities looking at this? If they're along a continuum, then if one community invests in beach renourishment, then the neighboring communities get the signal of erosion kind of slowing down, because you're gaining sediment, you're facing like less erosion, because there's the added sand from one community that's going to then spread into its neighboring communities, that's kind of giving sand to the neighboring communities. And so you experience a slower erosion because of that sediment gain, which means they're going to invest less in nourishment. The community that decides to be the first mover is adding sand to the beach. It's then going to erode. It's often going to erode exponentially or more quickly relative to its neighbors, which means relative to the neighbors, the community that is the early mover with nourishment tends to face a higher erosion and therefore will nourish more frequently, right? So how did we model this? We did exactly what I was talking about. We took one version of this model where we modeled it as a dynamic economic game between neighboring communities. And what we found in that case is when these communities are taking into account what their neighbors will do, then both communities or the neighboring communities have an incentive to wait, because then they're going to wait so that so that they're not the first mover. They can gain from the sand that is coming from a community that nourishes first. And as a result, this ends up being like a prisoner's dilemma. If you're familiar with the economic prisoner's dilemma game, it ends up being both communities or the neighboring communities tend to underinvest in beach renourishment when they are behaving strategically. Now, when you have a first mover, what happens? You see that the neighboring communities end up being free riders, whereas the town that moves first, that takes that decision and ends up making the first nourishment decision, ends up being a sucker. And because once you have invested, you're going to experience increased erosion, therefore you're going to have to nourish more and more frequently. So you see this checkered pattern where there are the communities that will keep rebuilding and communities that are going to hang back and wait, right? So we can take this model, right, and we model it first as an economic problem with fewer communities, just with two neighboring communities and how they are behaving strategically. Then we can take the insight from that economic model and then spread it along, and then take an extended coastline with multiple communities on it, and we find this, free rider and sucker behavior, which leads to, a few towns that are going to invest in nourishment many, many times relative to towns that are going to be the free rider towns, right? And this is not uncommon. Like, even when we take this to the data, we do find communities that nourish almost every year or every other year, situated right next to communities that wait a long time. And it's no surprise that there's also a direct, these towns that nourish more frequently are also towns that have higher property values to begin with, higher baseline property values to begin with. So what we find through this, right, taking one where we're using simple dynamics but a complex economic game, then using some of the insights from that underlying economic behavior to take, like, as a heuristic behavior, and modeling an extended coastline with multiple towns, we find that there is, if you left to themselves, if this is a decentralized decision-making process left to themselves, you end up with there is no incentive to coordinate. However, if we can put in place spatially targeted subsidies, these subsidies depend on a combination of the coastline or the coastal environment, that is the erosivity, as well as base property values. Then you can incentivize a coordinated decision making, and these gains from coordination actually increase with increasing sea level rise. So as sea level rise goes up, the gains from coordinating along the coast also tend to go up in terms of maintaining both the beach width or a stable coastline, as well as maintaining property values along the coast. Right. And so this is, again, just a way to think about how we can learn from both the geophysical modeling and the economic modeling, and ways by which you can start connecting the pieces to better understand the evolution of the coastline as a whole. The next kind of question that we've been interested in is thinking about, who is building on the coast and how quickly are we building? What is that built environment looking like? Here, there's been, quite a bit of work, and this work is growing now. The idea that we're building back bigger after storms, right? So we saw this damages go up exponentially at the very beginning. The damages from these disaster events go up exponentially. What we find here, so in the work that Eli and others have done, we find that when there is an episodic, when there is a shock, there is also investment in recovery, and it's that recovery process that then accelerates coastal development. And so as there is more coastal development, then the hazard risk goes up as well, right? Like, if you develop the coast more, then the storm risk or the storm damage goes up as well. So we have this development, this is what we're referring to as a development paradox, where in order to protect or in order to minimize damage to development, we invest in adaptation, and adaptation then accelerates development, which then puts more value at risk and thereby increasing the overall risk to a community. So what we did, and we sort of took this, again, we went back to North Carolina, and to study this, we actually looked at the timing of new development, timing of new homes being built along the coast. So we looked at 6 counties in North Carolina, about 50 block groups, so census units or neighborhoods you can think of. And what we did here is we asked the question, what are the factors? When is a parcel, an undeveloped parcel, likely to be developed, right? So along this entire coastline, several parcels that were undeveloped, and then we're looking at the rate of new development along the coastline. So we basically took the parcel map and we went back to 1993. and looked at what these maps look like in 1993 and what they look like in 2016. And we estimated the likelihood of development in every year starting from 1993. And what we find in this analysis is that the beach nourishment, so towns that invest in beach nourishment, or the investment in building out the beach, tends to increase the likelihood of new development. It also tends to increase redevelopment, which is a later paper that we just completed last year. And what's happening here is it's not necessarily the erosion or the storms that are sending the signal for more development. It is the storm signal combined with the adaptation behavior that then leads to accelerated development. And when there's accelerated development, we're then potentially increasing the risk or increasing the value at risk along the coast, which means in the future, that same location is likely to face a higher damage when the next storm comes around, right? So we're looking at coastal risk. Coastal risk itself decreases the likelihood of development. So if you just think about the likelihood of a storm, or there was a storm in this past year, or increased erosion. So places with higher erosion tend to have lower new development in general, on average. But then within those regions, places that have invested in adaptation through shoreline stabilization activity tend to see an increase in the likelihood of development by somewhere between 7 to 11% higher. So again, when we ignore these feedbacks, right, of what is happening when there is investment in adaptation, you tend to get this biased estimate of whether they're increasing development because of the storm effect or because of the adaptation effect, right? So this is where the development paradox comes around, where both in the case of new development and in a follow-up paper, when we looked at redevelopment projects, we find that the adaptation investment tends to accelerate the rate at which the coastline is being built out, which then places more risk for future events. So to wrap this all up, what we're finding, or at least by giving you a flavor for the different types of analyses that economists do, the sort of overall takeaway message is that you have these short-run adaptation measures, whether they're building seawalls, whether it is in the form of shoreline stabilization, or in some cases even in the vegetated buffers. These are adaptation strategies that pay for themselves. They maintain or increase in many cases property values. So when you look at the economy in a location, in any given community, it tends to do better after an adaptation investment. However, the same adaptation investment can tend to be maladaptive if you look at it in the very long run. Again, another example of why we need to be thinking about those long run dynamics and how building more on the coast is going to affect the need for more and more, the demand for more and more renourishment, and how it will affect storm surge, how it's going to affect the erosivity along different locations along the coast. So the takeaway message is that by investing, by building out the coasts rather densely, and by continually adapting, by continually investing to maintain that profile, to maintain the development profile that we've built up over the past century, we might in fact just be delaying what is inevitable, which is a retreat from the coast, in order to maintain that resilience in the long run. So broadly, this is just a flavor for the kinds of questions that we're asking in economics, and the need to then couple economic modeling of what value coastal amenities provide, and how those values then affect human decisions on the coast, both in terms of building on the coast and in terms of investing in coastal adaptation, and why, to better understand both the economic outcomes and the coastal outcomes, we need to be thinking about these feedbacks between the geophysical models and or the geophysical processes and economic behavior on the coast. Thank you very much for listening, and I will look forward uh, to seeing some of you maybe at the breakout sessions of the workshop itself. Thanks a lot.